this is one reason why we didn't see, we will not see these vaccines being made available via the medicines patent pool. We are seeing the therapeutics. They're easier to manufacture, and companies, generics, are capable of manufacturing them with the recipe, right? With the even with the MPP license. So there is a difference there. I think that compulsory licenses have a place, and they certainly have a place in even without them being used, the threat of them being used drove prices down in the early to mid 2000s after the Doha Declaration, as manufacturers came to the table. They could see what could have happened. Here, I think the compulsory license is only really going to be utilized in markets that remain underserved. Now, are there such markets? I'm not well placed to state. I have not been informed of any, but if there are markets where voluntary licenses are not reaching, where innovators are not reaching, then in fact a compulsory license could be helpful for therapeutics. As I said, for the reasons I've mentioned before, I'm fairly skeptical that we need this compulsory license in the current climate. You're still muted, Philip.
Thank you. I just can't get the technology to work. Thanks for that, Bryan. Going back to what Jennifer was saying earlier on, and this question is addressed to Jennifer. So assuming there were a waiver, you may well, in one scenario, see a lot of new manufacturers come to the table, or you might not actually, according to what Bryan's been saying. But assuming that did happen, how do you think this would impact the supply chain? Obviously, look, some of these products are quite complex, the therapeutics, and they involve lots of manufacturing inputs. Do you think this is going to disrupt supply when you have a bit of a land grab for scarce resources? You're on mute as well. Great, thanks.
Yeah, no, I've come off. I'm just thinking, I don't, first of all, I question whether there would be a kind of explosion of new manufacturers as the result of a TRIPS waiver. And this is just because of what I alluded to before. There's a substantial amount of collaboration, tech transfer with a global tech transfer partner, time investments that are required to build new manufacturing capacity for biologics. And so I think that even with the TRIPS waiver, we wouldn't see that immediately. But assuming we did, I think, yes, of course, there would be stress on value chains. And as several people have pointed out so far, these are complex value chains. Looking at the vaccines, Mark, who's unfortunately not here, and I co-authored a paper called Unprecedented about the innovation response to COVID. And as of July 2021, we found in relation to one vaccine that the value chain was, I think, 210 components, 67 suppliers in 11 countries. And that was early days before these manufacturing and distribution networks were really built out. So certainly they're very complex value chains. The indication, of course, for the therapeutics, it's the same. I've seen public information saying that Paxlovid, Pfizer's therapeutic, has 7 months lead time. So they need to source and secure the raw materials well before they need to use them. And so all this to say, you're asking the right question about needing to look at the entire value chain. And one point I'd like to make is that if you have end product manufacturing capacity, but there's not enough inputs and equipment, whether from tier 1, tier 2, et cetera, you have a bottleneck, right? So there's really a crucial need to consider the entirety of the value chain, the availability of inputs, when looking at things like building resilience into supply chains, making investments in supply chains, regulatory streamlining. Shouldn't be looking only at the end product. We need to look also at processes and inputs, and then other actions as well. And I also came across an interesting statistic while I was preparing for this seminar, that it takes around 18 months to 3 years to bring on a new manufacturing partner from start to the point when they are consistently making the quality product with approval. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And one thing our paper looked at, in addition to unpacking kind of the practical issues related to this process, is the enabling role of IP in supporting this technology and knowledge sharing among partners.
Okay, thanks, Jen. a comprehensive answer. Thank you for that. And Amir, leading on for that, a lot of the voluntary licenses that have been granted, not just for vaccines, but for therapeutics, have been to Indian generic suppliers. Assuming there were a waiver, where does this leave them? What signals does it send to the Indian industry that have kind of entered into good faith into licensing deals?
Yeah, two aspects to that, Finn. One is a historical perspective, and that is that we have gone on this path earlier. We did the same 50 years ago, where we had a 1970 Patent Act, where we said that we are going to cut out food and chemicals and drugs from patents. And that suddenly left a large number of players then wondering what to do next. And we had the growth of a large generic sector, which, as the good intention was in that Patent Act, which would ensure that drug supplies would be available to everybody at a reasonable rate, at what is talked about as a reasonable rate, and everything would be hunky-dory, and everybody would have access to medicines, diagnostics, and treatment. Lo and behold, 50 years passed, and we were where we were. Nothing had changed, even with us withdrawing patenting from drugs. We still had 4/5 of the country without access to drugs, and that's when we realized, with a little nudge from TRIPS, that this doesn't work, and that we need to get innovative medicine and treatment in. We were moving away from communicable diseases to non-communicable. We needed a large supply of new drugs, and therefore we went back and we came up with a very progressive, very modern patent law, which now granted the same uniform drug patents for companies across the world. We are back a full circle. We are doing the same. The script is exactly the same. We are saying again that a large number of us don't have access to drugs. Therefore, the solution is to give waivers. It's perplexing, and it's strange that we have lived through that. We have seen a broken health system allow a large number of people to die without hospital beds, without IV, without ventilators, without test kits. And now we want to fix something that is not the problem. The problem for India, very clearly, is our health financing. We spend less than 1% of our GDP. And for those of you who are not impressed with that, there are very few countries that spend less than 5%. Most of you spend upwards of 10% of a very large GDP. We spend 1%, and lo and behold, what would you expect the government to do when 5 million people die of COVID? What would you expect the federal government to do on its health budget? Like all of us simpletons who expected that the health budget would go up, we were in for a shock. And post-COVID, the health budget actually came down. So we have no new hospitals. We don't have new infrastructure. We don't allow a private sector to come into healthcare easily. And we now go back to what we had 50 years ago, which was to make the drug manufacturers responsible for everything that happens down the supply chain. Now, it is not rocket science at all. And there is the Lancet Commission, there is the India's Public Health Foundation, there is the government of India itself, which has given out data showing that what has failed us is a supply chain that does not reach drugs to the last mile. What has failed us is the abysmal number of doctors per 10,000 of population. We have right now among the worst doctor-to-patient ratio, barely 1 million doctors for 1.5 billion people, which makes it 0.9 doctors for 1,000, which is lower by any standard. The UK, for example, has 11, right? And still complains. We have several parts of India where you have a doctor for 100,000. Now, if that be and we have barely enough nurses. I mean, the number of nurses to the number of doctors, shockingly, is exactly the same. You'd normally expect 3 or 4 nurses to a doctor. We have 1 nurse to a doctor. And as a result, we have a system that is really crying out for additional resources in healthcare, be it from the public sector or the private sector, depending on whatever one sees as a solution to the broken health system. 80% of what exists is private already. So rather than give that some incentive to work more and to expand, what we are looking at is that tiny little wedge, that little pie in the chart, which says that drug costs, drug and diagnostics costs contribute to something like 20% of the total treatment. What about hospitalization charges? What about doctors' charges? That's 3/4 of the money. That's 3/4 of the 65% out-of-pocket expenditure that an Indian citizen spends when she goes to access a hospital. It is not. The diagnostic and the drug cost is not the major factor. It is at best 1/3 of the total cost. So therefore, it is really this easy way out of talking about something that appears like a good argument, that has friends from across the world, South Africa, Indonesia, Pakistan. We have a few who would agree, who by the way have similar problems and have similar broken health systems. So I think that it's very important for us to be able to understand that we have to fix the problem and not search for a new one.
Thanks, Amir. And then quickly to Bryan before we move on to the next topic in this this discussion. So going back to the voluntary licensing issue. So if the waiver were expanded, how do you think this would impact voluntary licensing as a phenomena, not just for COVID, but more generally, particularly with reference to lower middle income countries?
Yeah, it's I guess in terms of COVID, it's all dependent on really some of the issues we discussed before. I mean, theoretically, a waiver could lead to multiple new producers, perhaps let's just assume undercutting prices. Now, what would that happen? What would happen at that point? Perhaps we would see a collapse in the market for licensing. It wouldn't make financial sense for a company to enter into a license if they could manufacture the drug without it and still sell it for a profit. For reasons I mentioned before, competition and the vast, the availability of licenses now, for issues Jennifer mentioned, for instance, on costs and lead time and integration into supply chains. I don't really think we will see this explosion of new producers. So theoretically possible, which would, of course, have an impact going forward on therapeutics. We're not going to see that with vaccines simply because we're not going to have 100 new generic producers who can actually come to markets, who can produce the drug. If we look, more broadly, I mean, I think we have to say, more broadly, it wouldn't be a great trend, right? Licensing is part of the bread and butter of biotech and the pharmaceutical industry. And if there's uncertainty, really among industry players and among innovators, that, anytime there's a crisis, anytime there's a health crisis, even maybe loosely defined, this may occur, then in fact we might see not only less licensing, but in fact less R&D. I think this will lead into other things we'll discuss. So maybe I'll just stop there.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I wanted to shift this discussion now to innovation incentives and the impact of the waiver on those. And Jennifer, So it's been noted that several COVID treatments are the drugs that were originally developed to address other diseases. And some of the products that are out there might potentially have applications for other diseases in future. Obviously, that has big impacts on the discussions in Geneva. In your view, how could the negotiated WTO expanded waiver text be worded in such a way as to prevent in a watertight way to ensure that medicines are used to treat COVID are only used to treat COVID and not for any other use in future? Do you have any views on that?
So this dual use issue is an important issue. I'm glad you raised it. If you look at the products in preclinical, early pipeline, late pipeline, and approval stages of drug development, there's nearly as many repurposed products as novel products for COVID. And by repurposed, I mean products that were developed for other diseases or for diseases alongside COVID. And I think that those data points are important to look at, and the WTO negotiators need to have this in mind. We have a vaccine COVID waiver right now for a 5-year period, but this possible extension to different the different applications of these therapeutics, this increases the impact of the waiver, and it increases the risk for innovators. And I'd just like to pick up again on the point that Bryan was making, which is that there's a problem with a waiver in that as governments turn to a forced technology transfer position, that can undermine voluntary initiatives. So a waiver could potentially undermine the environment for all of the different voluntary collaborative efforts that are underway. So not just licensing through the MPP, new initiatives such as the ATOM initiative to make cancer medications available through a licensing platform, but then all of the different tech transfer partnerships. And this is because the environment for going in and working with a local partner and sharing the knowledge and technology to bring them into the value chain, it becomes less appealing, becomes more risky. And here again, referring to Mark, the paper that I wrote with Mark, by the middle of 2021, we saw that there were about 45 partnerships for tech transfer and manufacturing. Looking at that data earlier this year, there were over 300. And for therapeutics, there's around 180 tech transfer partnerships. So the knowledge and technology is getting shared. There are these partnerships being put in place, and these do rely on voluntary collaboration, often supported by IP rights, which make it safer to go in and share, as I said before.
Okay, thanks, Jen. And Bryan, building on that, so Jen has expressed some concern about the waiver, perhaps not being able to prevent the dual use of products for other use COVID products. Are there any lessons from the vaccine waiver? Did the vaccine waiver successfully handle this issue? Safeguards against abuse and diversion? Is there anything we could learn from that experience?
Well, if you're talking about the safeguards against diversion, transparency issues, notification, there's not much actually in the ministerial decision. I mean, to be frank, I don't even call it a waiver. It's really an extension of compulsory licensing provision. So I think, I call it the ministerial decision instead. And I think, what we see here is really just two provisions, and they're both fairly sparse. I mean, they are not as far reaching as the requirements that were set out in the earlier TRIPS waiver turned amendment into Article 31 bis, which came out of the Doha Declaration. So there's nothing actually in the ministerial decision that would regard, say, sanctioning for abuse. What we have is paragraph 3 and 5. So paragraph 3C actually contains really just two requirements. And the first is it requires members to undertake all reasonable efforts to prevent the re-exportation of products that have been manufactured under the authorization and imported into their territory. So to prevent re-exportation elsewhere. Now, again, the way that's drafted, all reasonable efforts, presumably this really means in accordance with their existing laws and doesn't require any additional measures to be taken. The second part of paragraph 3C requires members to ensure the availability of effective legal means to prevent the importation of those diverted drugs. So if they are being re-exported from one market, there's the kind of the other side of the coin, or the parallel provision, which is that countries have to have effective legal means to prevent the importation or the diversion into their market. Again, actually, the second sentence in that paragraph then says using the means required, already required, really under the TRIPS agreement. So this again, actually just kind of reminds members to make use of their existing measures to prevent the importation of diverted products. It doesn't actually require anything further. Paragraph 5 talks about notification requirements. And what it does is it requires eligible members, meaning the developing countries, to communicate to the Council for TRIPS of any measure regarding the implementation of the decision. So when they are in fact authorizing it. This is actually less burdensome than those required from Article 31 bis. In fact, one of the criticisms from civil society over the past 15 plus years has been that the procedures were too burdensome and therefore not used. Actually, these procedures, perhaps members listened, and certainly they are less onerous. For instance, notification does not have to predate the measure. Rather, the Article 5, Paragraph 5 states that it can happen as soon as possible after the adoption of the measure, right? So in fact, notification to TRIPS is not going to hold up anything that occurs here. Footnote 5 of Paragraph 5 also goes into what information must be addressed in the notification. Again, not very onerous. So while I will say, there is something there. There is an obligation not to divert or to prevent diversion. There is notification, but if you are looking for a solid, safeguard, I would say that it's fairly lacking.
Yeah. So to follow up on that, Bryan, say I don't know, a company in China were to use a COVID product for another purpose. Is there any way of enforcing anything against that company?
Well, I mean, this is a difficult one. And of course, China has actually made the binding declaration that they are not making use of the waiver. Presumably that will be extended to therapeutics and diagnostics. I mean, if we have, I guess there's two issues. The one is, well, if drugs are diverted, if the therapeutics diverted, then the product's not going to benefit from the waiver. It wouldn't actually be authorized, right? If it's re-exported from one market to another, it's not actually in accordance with the waiver anymore. That product could be seized and not allowed to enter the market. Enforcement obviously would be entirely on member states. To be frank, it appears more so like the honor system. Companies, I think, as with other products, it would be incumbent upon the IP owner to assist customs in patrolling the border to ensure diverted products don't enter the market. And as the case already in regards to counterfeit, as is the case already, really, in regards to counterfeits and parallel imports. I don't really see it becoming a WTO issue, though. It's more so, I think, a local enforcement issue. Now, as regards to the dual use products, I mean, I think this is a big issue that Jennifer's right to bring up. And it is something that the negotiators have to take seriously from the start. We can very easily throw out the term, this applies to therapeutics relating to COVID. Well, what does that mean, right? What are we actually talking about? And what is the scope? Now, again, presumably, if you have drugs authorized for the use of COVID and they start to be used for another therapeutic use, then in fact it's not in accordance with the waiver and wouldn't benefit anymore. It would actually not benefit from that protection. Just like the drug that's diverted from one market to another, it's going to lose its status as falling under the waiver at that point. How can you enforce it? Again, it's going to have to be the same. It's on member states or it's on the company itself to raise the issue. I think we all see many holes here.
Okay. A quick question from Jennifer from the floor. Rick DeSimone, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Jennifer, could you very briefly expand on the impacts of compulsory licensing would have on removing incentives from R&D into new uses for existing therapeutics? Do you think compulsory licensing would have an impact on those incentives?
I see two issues. I mean, one, you could go to an extreme and you could say that a waiver without appropriate management of the dual use problem could create almost like a perverse incentive to not vet your entire compound library for relevance to COVID. Because the second you identify things that are relevant to COVID, there's a big target on that product. I mean, that's taking it to an extreme. The biggest problem I see, there's different problems that arise here, mostly related to risk. During COVID, we saw that different companies brought what they had to the table and shared it openly with others because they knew they had IP protection and they could share without losing control over their knowledge, their technology, the fruits of many years of R&D investments. They knew that their companies would exist on the other side of the pandemic. So without that, they may not have collaborated in the same way. They may have, in response to the pandemic, worked with exclusively what they had internally. So I see this as undermining the potential for collaboration in the event of a future shock. That's one risk that I see. The other risk is really for the local tech transfer partners or the regional players, like I mentioned before. Here, there needs to be an appropriate environment for a global tech transfer partner to come in and effectively teach the partner the skills needed to integrate into the biologics value chain and ultimately to move up. Right? You don't want to stay at distribution and packaging forever. You want to move to fill and finish and upwards through the process that's called backwards integration. This does require a long-term collaboration and investments, training staff, et cetera, designing your facility, buying equipment, all of these things. And that environment is going to be less attractive to the global tech transfer partner if it doesn't include IP protection. So in effect, a waiver can even undermine collaborations that are happening now by making the environment less attractive should the government pivot to a forced tech transfer position.
Thanks, Jen. We got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to move on to the final section of this debate, the question of industrial policy. At an NGO briefing session at the latest ministerial conference, the WTO Director General stated that the outcome was justified on grounds that it would be desirable protectionism to achieve the objective of promoting vaccine manufacturing capacity in Africa and other developing countries, which implies that industrial policy rather than health was a key determinant for the vaccine waiver. And Amir, from an Indian perspective, how far do you think India's support and sponsorship of the waiver, both elements of it, is driven by industrial policy concerns to boost its own vaccine and generics industries?
Yes, Phil. Given the fact that India is indeed a large provider of vaccines and drugs, especially for the South, there is a push towards maintaining that balance, maintaining that position. However, the important thing that is often missed out is that the industry in India itself is very wary of such proposals. So, because any such push towards a waiver will diabolically impact Indian R&D. And given that most of these firms are looking at new drugs, because the generic market is that much and not more than that, they are looking at new drugs and new formulae and new investments in R&D. With a background that we have on how we view patenting and how politically we see it as anti-development, the private sector is wary, because if that thinking comes back and if we keep winning wars like this on waivers, then it is going to hurt Indian industry far more than anyone else. And in India, the pharma sector is a big sector. It's one of the fastest growing sectors. It was what really helped supply drugs and vaccines to most of Africa. and South Asia. And therefore, and the second point is that in the healthcare sector, India is rather a unique country where we are following a very devoted path towards privatization. Healthcare is almost entirely private now. It's a very small state sector that exists only for about 7% of the organized sector patients. So if we are going to going private on insurance and on healthcare, and are going to withdraw protection towards patents and designs, then we are going to create a confusion in the minds of the industry. Thanks.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, Amir, quickly. So I know the government of India is quite keen to upgrade the innovation capacities of the industry, and a lot of initiatives going on, including reform the IP system to make it more reflective of international higher standards. Yet there seems to be some disconnect with what the diplomats in Geneva are doing with the waiver. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, so what's happening is that two stakeholders are looking at it in two different ways. So the domestic private sector and not just pharma. We have a very strong IT sector too, and a very strong sector in terms of medicine. Both these sectors are looking at greater protection in terms of patent rights. So, and they are getting their voice heard because now they are becoming big. Some 3 or 4 of our richest individuals have great investments in pharma and in software. So on one hand, we have a situation where we are pushing for a uniform, universalized patent policy, geographical indications, and all of that. But on the other hand, because of a failure of the health system, we are pushing for waivers in Geneva. And that disconnect is becoming pretty obvious. And that disconnect is the reason for a lot of discomfort that we are seeing among new investors. And if that investment turns away, then it will find itself going to places which have a far greater clarity on patenting than on India. What we must understand is the point that is made time and again, that we have gone through this route and we have understood the importance of a strong intellectual property regime to be able to not only innovate on drugs, but also to make the healthcare provision universal. We cannot go back on that now.
Okay, thank you. I mean, we've got 5 minutes left, so I think we're going to have to speed it up a little bit, I'm afraid. Bryan, given that TRIPS is supposed to promote a level playing field, as it were, is there any way of meaningfully excluding countries from the waiver, such as happened with China with the vaccines, or do you think that relies too much on goodwill and have problems with enforcement?
Well, I mean, I think that it's a quite interesting provision. That the waiver essentially intends to exclude those with the capacity, the capability, the experience to efficiently and effectively manufacture at competitive prices. Now, I'm sorry, but if health was the primary objective, that wouldn't be the case. I think that is a clear indication that in the end, this is about industrial policy, and it's about countries that will take any opportunity to try to roll back TRIPS in IP protection. I actually feel sorry for public health activists who might have woken up the day after this is made to the realization that health was not the key objective here. And you have the Indian minister at the day after saying, well, vaccines, this agreement doesn't do anything because the vaccines aren't important anymore. There's an oversupply. We're throwing them away now. If that's the case, why did you continue arguing for a waiver for the past 2 years, right? If that's the case, if you really felt that was not going to be, that this was health. And in fact, he also mentioned the lead time of several months to get a factory on board. He didn't mention this before. I mean, all the statements before were a waiver will instantly lead to more more vaccines on the market. I think the one thing to say though, in relation to your question, is it is optional, right? Members are encouraged to opt out. It doesn't mean they're automatically excluded. I do think if a member does opt out and a company in that member state does try to produce the drug, it's not going to be too difficult to enforce against them via local laws, or it's an easy win in a TRIPS case. That I don't think is going to, the production would violate TRIPS and presumably the domestic law there. We will have to see how many other developing countries do opt out. I don't think it will be many. I think the US's primary concern and others' primary concern was simply with China in this regard. So I don't think we will actually see that many opting out. So I don't think this is going to be a major problem.
Okay, we've only got 2 minutes left. So Jen, I'm going to give you the last word. Looking more broadly and more holistically, imagine the waiver expansion were agreed. What do you think it means for the future of the TRIPS agreement and its knock on the international IP system as a whole? Sorry, it's quite a big question, but if you could be concise.
It's a really big question. Well, if I may, I'm going to pivot and just look at, I was taking some notes about what could be done, right? Instead of the waiver extension.
Okay, fine.
And there, setting aside IP entirely, I mean, going back to the basics, right? Investing in healthcare systems, that's an obvious one that a lot of us have flagged. But looking also at trade, we had the Trade and Health Initiative. It didn't go very far, but that could include things like, launching plurilateral to reduce tariffs on inputs and equipment, to make global value chains for biopharma, for biologics, be more efficient. That's like one idea. Creating the right environments for partnering in tech transfer. Initiatives like South Korea's new training hub for biomanufacturing in partnership with WHO. That's a great way to increase the skills base, human capital needed in many countries for biomanufacturing. And then there's also things like regulatory streamlining, right? Even going so far in a shock as to agree mutual recognition. So there are a lot of things, avoid policy arms races like export restraints. So there's many things that I think WTO members could be looking at in the trade realm. And just right now, it seems important that we look at, what happens with the waiver we have? Will people use it? Who can make the case for extending it to therapeutics and diagnostics? What does the data tell us? Is there a supply problem? And is this the way to solve it? So I think we need to go stepwise here as we move forward. And then I would love for people to focus on some of these things I've just mentioned at the WTO. So thank you, by the way, for having me. I forgot to thank you in the beginning.
Oh, my pleasure. If only politicians were honest when they pivot with questions, you announce you were going to do it. So they don't normally. So thank you for that. So that's the end of the session. I'll invite everyone to go to the chat box. Geneva Network has just released a short briefing paper on this. I invite you to click on that link and take a look. It just leaves me to thank Bryan, Amir, and Jennifer for your excellent contributions. Sorry, Mark couldn't be here. Thanks to all the attendees, some great questions. This will be made available online. I will send a link to everyone probably tomorrow. But it just leaves me to say thank you very much, and we'll see you at the next Geneva Network webinar. Good afternoon. Goodbye.